Welcome to our first presentation on experiments. In this presentation, I will focus on one of the main strengths of an experiment, which is the causal relationship, or what causes what. Experiments offer strong causal relationship. Can you remember the criteria for a causal relationship? You'll find this information from Chapter 3. Pause the presentation to see if you can determine what are the 3 criteria for a causal relationship. So a causal relationship signifies that there is an association, a direction of influence, and non-spuriousness. Let's take a look and remind ourselves what each of these 3 things mean. First is an association. So there's a relationship between these 2 variables, variable A and B. Next, we determine the direction of influence. So which one causes change in the other? Here we see that we're hypothesizing that variable A causes change in variable B. Lastly, we want to check that it's non-spurious, meaning that a third variable is not causing the change. How can we ensure that an experiment meets those conditions? Through the manipulation of independent variable, the measurement of a dependent variable, random assignment, and constancy of conditions. The first 2 steps address the association and direction of influence criteria of a causal relationship, while steps 3 and 4 address non-spuriousness. Okay, so now we know what are the criteria for causal relationships and how an experiment, the method of experiment, can meet those conditions. So let's look at an example of this, of an example experiment discussed in the textbook. The example in the book comes from this article in the Social Psychology Quarterly. Before we move on, be sure that you have read this chapter and especially the section Introductory Example, Misconduct in Criminal Prosecution. This starts on page 182 for students with the 4th edition of the book and page 174 for those with the 3rd edition, which is the edition in the library. In their study, Lucas and colleagues hypothesized that the greater the severity of crime, the more likely that misconduct will occur. One example of prosecutorial misconduct is not giving to the defense any evidence that might pertain to the defendant's guilt or innocence. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So the researchers here were examining 2 variables. Can you find which variables those are in their hypotheses? Pause the presentation while you reread the hypotheses and find the 2 variables. The variables are severity of crime and prosecutorial misconduct. Can you see how they have operationalized the variables or identify ways to observe variation in the variables? They have operational severity of crime by labeling it as either murder or assault. And they have operationalized prosecutorial misconduct by the number of questions implicating another suspect that were not turned over to the defense. This is how they were measuring their variables. So we have a potential association between 2 variables and a hypothesis of the direction of influence and the causal relationship, that the severity of crime leads to greater prosecutorial misconduct. But how to prove it? Let's go through those 4 steps of an experiment. Open your textbook to the summary of the study. Again, this is page 182 for the 4th edition and page 174 for the 3rd edition. Again, if you haven't read please be sure to read before continuing with this presentation. I'm assuming that you have read the summary, and the examples will not be clear if you haven't. The first step in an experiment is to manipulate the independent variable. So we have two variables, severity of crime and misconduct. Which one is the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable? Pause the presentation to find them. The independent variable is severity of crime. The dependent variable is misconduct. So researchers are assuming that variation in the severity of crime, murder or assault, will have an effect on whether or not the prosecutor engages in misconduct. Now that we know the independent variable and the dependent variable, how can we manipulate the severity of crime? If you remember, there were two groups of participants who were acting as prosecutors in the study. Both were given identical police reports except for one important variation. One group of participants received reports that resulted in the victim being pronounced dead at the scene, so they had the murder condition. The other group of participants received reports where the victim fully recovered from injuries, the assault condition. So this is how researchers manipulated their independent variable, severity of crime. Group A believes that the victim died, which is much more severe than the report that the other group received. So now the researchers want to see if the murder group, Group A, is more likely to withhold information than the assault group. This is the measurement of the dependent variable. So we have manipulated the independent variable, severity of crime. Now we need to measure if it had an effect on the dependent variable, misconduct. Remember that the researchers defined and operationalized prosecutorial misconduct to see if prosecutors would withhold evidence from the defense team. How did the researchers measure this misconduct? They asked participants to do the following. The two groups read the reports, the police reports, and other relevant material such as interviews with police, or the police interviews with witnesses. Remember that one report resulted in a murder and the other an assault. In the interview, there were 4 questions with information that identified the victim's wife as a potential suspect. Next, participants were asked to create a list to share with the defense. This is the important step that will be measured. So researchers measured the dependent variable by seeing if one group would withhold more information than the other. And in fact, one group did. The murder condition group would withhold more information than the assault condition group, specifically those questions pointing to the victim's wife as a potential suspect. So their hypothesis was correct. The more severe the crime, the more likely that misconduct would occur. Our first 2 steps, manipulating the independent variable and measuring the dependent variable, provide us with information on the association between the 2 variables and the direction of influence. But how can we ensure that the relationship is not spurious, that there isn't another variable influencing why a participant would withhold information? The last 2 steps help address this issue: random assignment and constancy of conditions. Random assignment is the assignment of participants to experimental conditions by means of a random device, such as a coin toss. So this is different than random sampling. Random sampling is a method of choosing participants for the study, step 1. Random assignment is step 2. We have our sample and we need to divide it into 2 groups. Let's say that the murder condition is the experimental group and the assault condition is the control group. For each participant, we toss a coin and assign them randomly to one or the other group. By virtue of random assignment, this ensures that individual characteristics which might influence whether or not they share relevant information with defendants, is evenly distributed between the two groups. Let me give you an example why random assignment is so important. What if instead of random assignment for the groups, more women happen to be in the experimental group and more men in the control group? Would we be able to say with certainty that it was the severity of the crime that influenced prosecutorial misconduct? No, gender might have had an influence. In an experiment, we have to make sure that it's the manipulated variable that is causing change, not another extraneous variable. This is the similar logic behind having a constancy of conditions. This means that every aspect of the study is the same except for the manipulated variable. In this study, everything was the same except for the murder versus assault condition. Participants were told the same story, the study took place in the same room, they all had access to the same information, except that one turned into a murder, one was only an assault, and they were all given the same tasks. To review, here's a flowchart of the experimental process. I will focus only on the steps that I covered in this presentation. So when we design the experiment, what are we looking for, and how will the experiment answer our question? After having recruited participants, we begin or introduce the experiment. Participants are randomly assigned to the experimental conditions so that participants are either given the murder condition or the assault condition. This is also the manipulation of the independent variable. Then we measure the dependent variable, how many participants engaged in misconduct. This is the end of the presentation. Please start the next one.